Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy and the modern world, moving into the reign of Pope 242, Pope Innocent XI, the last pope of the 17th century, who reigned from 1691 to 1700. Being dissatisfied with the performance of the diplomatic pope they elected previously, the conclave of 1691 went to the opposite extreme and elected a Zelanti as Pope 242. His baptismal name was Antonio Pignatelli, Pignatelli. He accepted election on July 12, 1691, taking the name Innocent XII, under which he reigned for 9 years. It took them 5 months to decide, but he proved to be a good choice. Born in Puglia in the Kingdom of Naples on March 13, 1615, Pignatelli had vast experience as a priest on both sides of the ecclesiological spectrum. He had served as nuncio to Tuscany, Poland, and Vienna. He had been a governor in the Papal States over the city of Viterbo, and he served as a bishop of 2 dioceses, the Diocese of Lecce and Fesna, before becoming Cardinal Archbishop of Naples in 1687, and that's the position he held when he attended the conclave. His personal life was beyond reproach. In all of his positions, even those that gave him access to substantial money, he lived frugally and earned a reputation for generosity and integrity. The power and wealth of the papacy did not change him at all. In terms of papal administration, some were disappointed, but none who knew Innocent were surprised when he immediately began cutting expenses of the papal curia, the ceremonies of the Vatican court, and in the papal state. His personal lifestyle changed very little. He ate his meals with the staff, and any cardinal or prelate who wanted to dine with him had to share the table with them. He ate in the kitchen. That's what I mean with the staff. Nepotism had been a moral bane to the papacy for centuries that we covered way back in the patristics, the old feudalism problem. In a document, Romanum Decet Pontificem, dated June 2nd, 1692, Pope Innocent decreed that a pope should never grant revenues or estates to a relative. If a relative was poor, he could care for them just as he would care for other people who were poor. But he could not provide for them by giving them, a church job. France, that issue was on his desk, the regalia controversy. The rift with France was still a problem. It appeared to have no resolution. Disdaining the petticoat diplomacy of his predecessor, who attempted to negotiate through a mistress of Louis XIV, Pope Innocent XII simply informed the French ambassador that a settlement could be reached at any moment by the French king simply abandoning his position, his immoral position, his immoral assertion of regalia rights. And at length, Louis XIV backed down, as now over half of the dioceses in France had no properly installed bishop. On September 14th, 1693, Louis revoked the decree, demanding that all candidates for French dioceses swear to the 4 Gallican Articles. Pope Innocent then granted the bishops canonical institution after they did that, and restored the hierarchy after an 11-year breach that might have resulted in schism. In terms of teaching, the Quietism issue now spreads to France. As we observed, the leadership of France had proven consistently subversive to the authority of the Holy See, even though the country was officially Catholic and the Catholic Church was the established church at this period in French history. As often happens in such environments, the zeal and devotion of loyal Catholics is increased by the shameful deeds of anti-Catholic people. This happened in France in a number of ways. One of the ways that came to the attention of Pope Innocent XII was a movement of mysticism, spirituality, that was labeled as a French version of the Quietism of Miguel de Molinos. Pope Innocent XI had condemned the Quietism of Molinos, condemned 68 propositions of it on November 2nd, 1687. In 1676, the year after Molinos published his spiritual guide, and 11 years before it was condemned, his influence made it into France through a Barnabite friar named Francois Lacombe, who lived from 1643 to 1713. One of his spiritual directees was a lady named Jean-Marie Guyon, Guyon. She lived from 1648 to 1717. We meet her, at this point, as a 28-year-old widow with 3 children. She had lived an exceptionally difficult life, filled with what today would be characterized as domestic violence. Father Lacombe instructed her to read the spiritual guide of Molinos, which had not yet been condemned, but which had at that point been translated into French. She took to the ideas immediately because her life had been largely out of her control. So the possibility of achieving holiness through a state of helplessness appealed to her. So her beliefs, the French version of Quietism, was that a spiritual journey that began with an awareness of the presence of God, then moved directly to the state of transforming union. After a time, this union was taken from her, and she experienced mystical death, a desolation that led to mystical death. The return of the transforming union came through the initiative of God as a transformation that took the form of a reawakening of her being. She used the term that she was possessed by God. Possessed is the word she used, such that she became an automaton in his hand, a puppet in God's hands. Her advice on prayer, after relaying this story, began with traditional meditation, then moved to what she called a prayer of simplicity, which was her version of the prayer of recollection, which we covered earlier in the Carmelite section. But ended, her paradigm of prayer had the end that prayer was no longer needed, because the soul possessed by God was by that fact always united with God. Therefore, prayer was not necessary. Reaching out to God was not necessary because, in her way of thinking, once one is possessed by God, then one is always in union with God. And it was that, the possession and all that's what led to her condemnation. This image of her being possessed by God sounded too much like demonic possession, and her concept of the human person being transformed into a puppet reflected a defective anthropology. Her assertion that the soul so possessed by God no longer needed to pray was just stupid. In the Gospels relate, Jesus himself prayed constantly, and he was the second person of the Trinity. So to claim that we who follow him do not need prayer, do not need to do the same, is not only unsubstantiated by our tradition, but actually is contradicted by the Gospel, and is frankly downright bizarre. Nevertheless, her personal goodness as a human being and her obvious devotion drew followers to her. For 12 years, she lived in this way as part of a circle of pious Catholics, supporting each other under the government controlled by an impious monarch. All of that changed when the Quietism of Miguel de Molinos was condemned in 1687, when his book, The Spiritual Guide, was condemned, 1687. Her ideas resembled his so closely that both Madame Guyon as well as her spiritual director, Father Lacombe, were arrested in 1688. One of her disciples at the time of her first arrest was a 37-year-old priest named Francois Fenelon, Fenelon, who lived from 1651 to 1715. He was ordained a priest in 1675. Later would become an archbishop in 1695. In 1684, he was assigned to work with Huguenot women, French Calvinist women, who wished to convert and become Catholic. To this end, he established a residential school for them, essentially a boarding school for adults, based on a modified Benedictine rule. Like Francis de Sales, whose books were required reading at Fenelon's school, Fenelon believed that the rightness of the Catholic faith, correctly presented, was superior to forcible conversions. The Loyal Catholic Network, which had always existed in France, but sometimes had to not attract attention to themselves, put him in touch with Madame Guyon, before she was condemned. And he used her writings and her methods as a means of reaching out to these Huguenot women through the experience of another woman who had suffered much in her life, unjustly. The result was a high degree of success for 4 years, until Madame Guyon's arrest. Fenelon believed that Madame Guyon was being falsely accused of heresy. In order to get her out of prison, he made her write out a summary of her beliefs and had them examined by theologians in Paris. Those theologians pronounced her summary to be free of heresy, so she was released from prison after 7 months. It was thought then that the entire affair was a misunderstanding. Over the next 7 years, Fenelon's influence grew. He was appointed as a tutor to King Louis XIV's grandson. Louis, at the time, he had the title Duke of Burgundy. And Fenelon was ordained Archbishop of Cambrai in 1695. Parallel to that, Madame de Guyon's influence also grew, especially among women. Because of this, she earned the enmity, because of envy, of several important bishops. Among them, none other than Jacques Bossuet, the Bishop of Meaux, who had authored the 4 Gallican Articles of 1682. He saw that she was accused again. This time, she was accused of sabotaging the sacrament of confession through presenting herself as a spiritual director. Now, that's misleading. She was kind of a spiritual director to these women, but she was not. She never said or tried to tell them that they should not go to sacramental confession. And then he renewed the accusation that she was purveying the condemned heresy of Quietism. So she was arrested again in 1695 and confined in the Bastille while a conference was held at Issy to examine all of her writings, not just the summary that Fenelon had used to get her released years earlier. That conference at Issy did something curious. They produced a statement consisting of 34 articles summarizing Catholic spirituality, but did not condemn Madame de Guyon. Fenelon, who by this point was an archbishop, was present at that conference, and he actually wrote 4 of those articles. He left the conference with a copy of all the articles, went directly to the Bastille to get Madame de Guyon to sign all of those articles, which she did. He then went personally to the king and presented this as a signed submission in order to get her release from prison. So here Madame de Guyon fell victim to politics. Again, the king's favorite bishop, Bishop Bossuet, who had authored the 4 Gallican Articles, resented Madame de Guyon for her popularity. Now Fenelon outranked him because Fenelon was an archbishop and Bossuet was just a bishop. But Fenelon had never signed the 4 Gallican Articles because he was not a bishop at that point. The 4 Gallican Articles were invented in 1682. Fenelon did not become a bishop until 1695. So the king still preferred Bossuet, and Bossuet continued to insist that Guyon was a heretic of the Quietist variety. Now, Fenelon never gave up, but Madame de Guyon stayed in prison for another 7 years until he managed to get her released on March 21st, 1703. She signed a retraction of everything she had ever written. And after she was released, she spent the rest of her life in a small village, a broken person who never wrote anything ever again. This issue came to the attention of Pope Innocent XI in terms of quietism. Bishop Bossuet, his vindictiveness was not satisfied. He is now, since Fenelon had defended Guyon, and Bossuet hated Guyon, so now Fenelon became his enemy. But Fenelon outranked him, so, he had to proceed carefully. Bossuet thought to destroy Fenelon by denouncing a book that Fenelon wrote in 1697 titled Explanation of the Sayings of the Saints. So Bossuet accused Fenelon of the heresy of quietism, saying it was in that work. Unaware of the complicated political intrigues surrounding Madame Guyon, Bossuet simply extracted 23 statements from the work and condemned them as heretical and sent them to Pope Innocent XII. Innocent XII was completely unaware of all of this background, just presented with these statements out of context, and he condemned them. The Pope condemned them on March 12th, 1699, in the document Cum Alias. Fenelon submitted immediately, but his ecclesiastical career was over. That explains why it took him so long to get Madame Guyon freed. And in the end, he had to resort to bribery in order to get her out of jail. This entire unsavory episode shows how interwoven politics and theology were in a not only in a Catholic country, but one where the Catholic Church had established status. So this is yet another late reiteration of the feudalism problem, when the church was too integrated into the government, And also why episodes like this were also why so many were prepared to listen to the Enlightenment philosophers who ridiculed religion as nothing more than politics wearing vestments. In other developments, Louis XIV continued to cause problems in the secular world just as he did in the religious. In 1671, his younger brother, one of his younger brothers, Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, married Charlotte Elizabeth, the daughter of the Elector Palatine, whose name was Karl. Palatine's in Germany. So that marriage took political marriage, standard, dynastic practice. So that marriage took place in 1671. 14 years later, in 1685, Charlotte's brother, the Elector, died. And then the electorate passed to his son, Charlotte's nephew, also named Karl. So this was Karl II. But Karl II also died childless. The electorate should then have passed to her. But that would have meant that Louis XIV's brother, who was married to Charlotte, would then have been, everyone perceived that he would be the de facto, he would de facto become one of the 7 imperial electors, the younger brother of the King of France. That was completely unacceptable to anyone in Germany or Austria. So they passed the electorate to a more distant relative, violating the inheritance laws of their own country. In 1688, Louis XIV decided to press his sister-in-law's claim to the electorate and invaded Germany. Palatine was part of Germany. He invaded for the purpose of adding it to France. This invasion provoked the formation of an alliance called the Grand Alliance against him. This included not only Germany and Austria, but also Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Savoy, and England. Louis's devouring ambition had this effect on people. that Protestant and Catholic countries allied against him, even though he was officially Catholic. So of that list, half of Germany was Protestant, the other half Catholic. Austria was all Catholic. Spain was all Catholic. The Netherlands was Protestant. Sweden was Protestant. Savoy was Catholic. England was Protestant. But all of those allied together against Louis because of his obvious expansionist, designs. This War of the Grand Alliance lasted for 9 years, bringing fighting to Italy, Spain, Holland, Belgium, and Germany. It was ended by the Treaty of Ryswick, Ryswick, in 1697, in which Louis surrendered his claim to the electorate of Palatine, but he retained control of Strasbourg because his troops were there. 3 years after the end of that war, a similar situation was created because of the dynastic intermarriages, when Carlos II, King of Spain, from 1665 to 1700, died without an heir, died childless in the year 1700 at the turn of the century. Now, King Carlos made provision for this by naming as his heir designate Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. The problem was that man died childless on February 6th, 1699. Now, King Carlos II was still alive. He then had to decide. He knew if he died without naming an heir, Spain would, descend into civil war. So he had to name an heir. He then had to decide between a Habsburg contender, Archduke Karl of Austria, who would then become Carlos III of Spain, or a French Bourbon contender. This would be Philippe, the Duc d'Anjou, who was one of the many grandsons of Louis XIV. Because Carlos II had been beaten more than once by Louis XIV's armies, Carlos believed that a Bourbon would be more likely to keep the Spanish Empire intact. So he decided on the French Bourbon candidate, and by this decision doomed Europe to more warfare. Carlos died less than a year later, on November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day. The horrific consequences of this will be seen in the reign of the next pope. But Innocent XII died in the same year, the turn of the century, September 27th, 1700, after a reign of 9 years and 2 months. He was followed by the first pope of the 18th century, who reigned for 21 years under the pontificate of Clement XI. So it is to his reign that we will turn in the next video. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.